Muy buenas tardes. Oye, muy buenas tardes. ¿Cómo? There's also East Harlem. You're in West Harlem, but I grew up in East Harlem. And when I was asked to speak about my spirituality, my institution building, I got very complicated. You know, I try to make it very difficult because we have 7 minutes, right? And then I said, you know, how did it start? Where does it come from? So I'd like to dedicate today to my family, to my mom, to my dad, who came from Puerto Rico, separately, not knowing each other, and met in El Barrio. So El Barrio becomes an institution for me, because it's where I grew up, where my parents bore 3 children, where my grandmother, Luisa Palacio, brought 3 men, 3 sons from Puerto Rico escaping racism. So I'd like to introduce you to them. Flora Cruz Marcano, who had dreams of being a nurse, and because Puerto Rico is still a colony of the United States, wasn't able to pursue her dreams in the early 20s. My father, with a 3rd grade education, came as an Afro-Boricua black man to New York, to El Barrio. And New York didn't know about Puerto Ricans, so they couldn't understand a black man speaking Spanish, right? So that when he tried to use his skills that he had learned being mentored by a carpenter, he wasn't able to work with his hands because they thought he came as a janitor, right? And there's nothing wrong with being a janitor, but it was the inability for him to pursue what he had learned in Puerto Rico. El Barrio, for those of you who don't know East Harlem, is around 99th Street up to 5th Avenue to about 125th Street. And this is something that my mother instilled in us. That if we were going to live in the world, if we were going to have a place in the world, we had to see ourselves in the other. That we could not live in this world, or I could not live in this world without finding a place. And how was I to find a place in this world was to define myself, not only in terms of my color and my culture, but also in terms of my spiritual journey. El Barrio, and the slides are out of order, but it's okay. El Barrio, for my grandmother, who was a spiritist. On television now they call him a medium or a channeler. But she was a spiritist. She was a healer with her hands. In El Barrio, she went to La Marqueta and bought healing plants and knew the medicinal properties of healing plants. So the sister talking about Ecuador is absolutely on point because plants heal. And she had the power to heal not only with her hands, but the knowledge of plants and their medicine. She was the local doctor, a woman who couldn't read or write, but understood that having imagery that looked like us, that looked like her children, would give them the power to move in the world with confidence. We grew up in tenements, looking gray from the outside, but on the inside, blazing in color. I mean, absolutely blazing in color. Red represented the divinity of thunder, Chango. Blue, the waves of the ocean. Talk about waves, the waves of the ocean, the eternal mother, Yemaya. White reflected the creativity and the power of creation. So when you went into my grandmother's house, what you saw, what were today are called installations, her apartment was an installation of altars. To those who had gone before, to those divinities that she said were Africanos, right? They were black. She knew they were Africanos, but if she had to point it in a map, she wouldn't know how. But it's not until I get to college, to NYU, that I open a book and see an image that looks like the image that my grandmother had behind her door. And that image was El Egua. El Egua, the colors, red and black. They talk about balance. They talk about how one lives in the world and how one creates that environment which gives you a place of surety. So before I went to school, tobacco smoke cleansed me so I could pass a grade, pass my test, right? Before I went to school, leaves were put on me to cleanse my spirit and cleanse me and create balance. And also the philosophy that donde come uno, comen dos, comen tres. Where one eats, two eat, three eat, four eat, right? Because we live in community. And I understood that in order to move in the world, I had to live in community. So in the process of identifying as a black woman, as a puertorriqueña en el barrio, and also in the world, I traveled to Brazil, I traveled to Nigeria, I traveled to South Africa, traveled to Cuba, where I initiated as a Yoruba priestess. I traveled to Jamaica, traveled to Brazil, and the one thing that became apparent and obvious is that there is a special thread that runs throughout the African world. There is a philosophical, sacred aesthetic that defines us as a people. And in the creation of institutions, which include el Museo del Barrio, the Association of Hispanic Arts, was that fundamento, that foundation that my grandmother and my parents taught me, to always remain rooted in that tradition, in those traditions that spoke to my history, spoke to my legacy, and spoke to those who came before me. What my abuela called los espíritus, the spirits. So that in forming institutions, consciously and unconsciously, the work has been to connect our experiences as African diaspora peoples of the world and understand how that philosophical framework, how that aesthetic framework has created the uniqueness of expression that we possess as a people, be it in the south of the United States, be it in the streets of Salvador de Bahia, be it in La Habana, be it in Loíza, Puerto Rico. The diaspora is immense. If we go to Ecuador, you see African descendants. If you go to Peru, you see African descendants. If you go to Puerto Rico, if you go to East Harlem, West Harlem, you see our people. And what is absolutely clear, and what is absolutely definitive for me, is that we all are connected. Because either the colonial experience, the post-colonial experience, the legacy of our people have remained in the memory of who we are. So that you can go to La Habana today and African descendants are speaking in Yoruba and Congo in terms that are no longer present in Africa. You can go to Brazil and find the same thing. So that our memory has been spread throughout the world, and the work that I continue to do is bringing that memory together. Not only as memory, but as that thread that will continue an aesthetic, that will share an aesthetic to the globe. Thank you for your attention.